The streets were silent, but the air hummed with the tension of something about to break loose. In the heart of the city, where the shadows of towering buildings stretched far into the night, Detective Ethan Blackwell paced slowly, his mind racing. A storm was coming, not in the weather, but in the case he had been trying to crack for weeks. A string of murders, all connected by a thread too thin to grasp, and yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being led somewhere dark, somewhere dangerous. But the more he followed the clues, the more everything seemed to twist into confusion. It was as if someone, or something, was playing with him. Ethan wasn't just any detective, he was known for his razor-sharp mind and his unyielding determination. But something about this case, about the victim's final moments, seemed different. The first clue had come in the form of a cryptic note, tucked inside the pocket of the first victim. It had been strange, almost nonsensical. Follow the light, but don't trust the shadow. At first, Ethan had dismissed it as nonsense, a trick to throw him off. But as he moved through the case, it became clear, the clues weren't leading him forward, they were circling back. Every piece of evidence felt like a loop, a never-ending circle. The city itself seemed to conspire against him. The moonless nights were filled with strange whispers, and the chill of the wind seemed to echo with the voices of the lost souls who had crossed the line. His office, usually a sanctuary of order, had become a prison of tangled threads. There were so many questions. Why had the victims been chosen? What was the connection between them? And why was he hearing the victims' thoughts? It had started subtly at first, little snippets of voice, faint whispers that felt like they were floating just beyond his reach. He had been working alone in his office when he first heard it, the victim's voice, calm but filled with desperation. "You have to stop. Don't follow me." It sent a shiver down his spine. He had shaken his head, convinced that it was exhaustion. But it hadn't stopped there. The more Ethan followed the case, the more he heard. The victims' thoughts, trapped in the final moments of their life, somehow reaching across the void to warn him. But the problem was, the thoughts weren't clear. Each time he heard them, they twisted, changed, and took him in circles. He'd rush to a scene, certain it was where the next clue would appear, only to find nothing. The next day, the voice would come again, "It's not there. You missed it." The words cut through the air like a blade, leaving him with a sense of deep frustration. The more he tried to piece it all together, the further he seemed to fall into confusion. As the days went on, Ethan began to question his own sanity. Were these voices real? Or was the pressure of the case breaking him? He could no longer tell. Each step he took led him to the same place, a place he couldn't reach. He had all the pieces, but the puzzle was too complicated, too elusive. Ethan's background only added to the weight of his obsession. He wasn't just a detective, he was a man haunted by the past. His father had been a brilliant detective, one of the best, but he had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His disappearance had haunted Ethan's childhood, driving him to the same profession. Now, years later, the case had returned to him, this twisting, maddening case that felt like it was connected to the shadows of his past. Was this a message? A challenge? Or was the truth buried so deep that even he could never uncover it? And yet, despite the confusion, despite the endless loops and false leads, Ethan couldn't walk away. It wasn't just about solving the case anymore, it had become personal. The voices, the clues, they weren't just leading him in circles. They were leading him to something greater. Something that had been waiting for him all along. The city was a labyrinth, and in the maze of its streets, Ethan found himself at the center of a mystery so tangled, so twisted, that every turn threatened to drive him mad. He had been chasing the shadows for weeks, but with each passing day, he felt himself getting closer. He had to keep moving, no matter how many times the puzzle reassembled itself in a way he couldn't understand. And then, the next clue arrived, as it always did, a whisper in the dark, a voice that seemed to come from within the walls. "It's closer now, you're almost there." Ethan stared at the message on the screen, his fingers trembling. The victim's thoughts were becoming clearer, but more dangerous too. The voice, once calm, now seemed desperate, frantic even. Was the victim trying to guide him? Or was it all just a trap? The city had never felt so cold. In this introduction, we meet Detective Ethan Blackwell, a man driven by his need to solve the case of a series of murders that seem to twist and turn with every clue. His past, marked by the mysterious disappearance of his father, has shaped him into the relentless detective he is today. But now, a strange phenomenon is complicating things. The voices of the victims seem to reach him across time, and they guide him down a path full of contradictions. The setting is a modern, gritty city, filled with shadows and mystery. The story unfolds during the late hours of the night, with the streets empty and the only noise the whispers of a troubled mind. The conflict begins with a seemingly unsolvable case and becomes personal as Ethan feels the weight of his past bearing down on him. The voices lead him, but their directions only make the situation more confusing. Each clue is both a revelation and a dead end. As the story progresses, Ethan will have to confront not only the truth behind the murders but the haunting legacy of his father's disappearance. The city, with its secrets and darkness, will either reveal everything he's been searching for, or send him spiraling into madness. Ethan's world had always been ruled by logic, by patterns, by the cold, hard facts that came with being a detective. But that night, everything changed. It had been a long, exhausting week, with nothing but false leads and endless confusion. The voices, those eerie whispers of the victim's thoughts, had grown louder, more urgent. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. He had been chasing shadows for too long. But as he stood in his office, staring at the case files spread out before him, something shifted. The phone rang, its sharp tone slicing through the silence. Ethan picked it up without thinking, the weight of fatigue pressing on his shoulders. "Blackwell," he said, his voice heavy with disinterest. The voice on the other end was frantic, breathless. "Detective Blackwell? You need to come down to the station, right now. There's something you need to see." Ethan sat up straight, the fatigue momentarily forgotten. "What is it?" His voice sharpened, his instincts kicking in. "It's about the case. A new lead just came in. But this is different. You need to see it for yourself." The urgency in the officer's voice struck a chord deep within him. He hung up the phone, grabbed his jacket, and rushed out of the office. The night air hit him like a wall, cold and biting. The city streets stretched out before him, dark and empty. The shadows seemed to pull at him, beckoning him toward the unknown. As he made his way to the station, Ethan's mind raced. What new twist could there possibly be? Every time he thought he was getting close, the case slipped further away. The voices had stopped coming to him for a while, and he'd almost convinced himself that he was losing his grip on reality. But now, this. Ethan arrived at the police station, his footsteps echoing in the hallway as he walked towards the briefing room. Detective Marta Lawson, a no-nonsense woman who had worked alongside him for years, was waiting for him at the door. "You're here," she said, her face tight with concern. "You're going to want to see this." Ethan stepped inside, and his eyes were immediately drawn to the table in the center of the room. On it lay a folded piece of paper, its edges worn, as though it had been handled many times before. The moment his fingers touched the paper, a sudden chill ran up his spine. Something about it felt wrong, like it wasn't just a piece of evidence, but something far more personal. "This came in through an anonymous tip," Marta explained. "We've been investigating the connections between the victims, and this changes everything." Ethan unfolded the paper, his gaze scanning the words quickly. His heart skipped a beat as he read the message written in bold, jagged letters. "The answers are hidden in the thoughts. You're closer than you think, but beware, what you hear may not be what you need to know." "What does that mean?" Marta asked, her voice low. Ethan stared at the message for a moment, his mind spinning. Thoughts? The victim's thoughts? Could this be the clue he'd been waiting for? But the message, written in such a cryptic and menacing way, raised more questions than answers. "It's them," Ethan muttered, his voice trembling with both fear and excitement. "It's the voices. The victims, they're trying to communicate with me." Marta frowned. What do you mean? Ethan, you're not. I'm not crazy, Marta. Ethan snapped, his voice sharp, the frustration boiling over. I've been hearing them, each one of them. Their last thoughts. They're reaching out to me. And now it's all starting to make sense. Marta took a step back, unsure of how to respond. She had seen Ethan at his best and at his worst, but never like this. He was always calm, controlled. But tonight, something had shifted inside him. She could see it in his eyes, he was on the edge of something. The question was, would it lead him to the truth, or would it push him over the edge? The moment was interrupted by a loud bang from the hallway, followed by hurried footsteps. A uniformed officer appeared at the door, breathless. Detective Blackwell, you need to see this, the officer said, his voice tense with urgency. Ethan followed him down the hall, his heart pounding in his chest. They reached the back of the station, where the evidence was stored, and the officer pointed toward a small security room. Inside, the dim light revealed a row of monitors, each showing a different angle of a security camera. Ethan stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the footage. It was from the night of the most recent murder. But what stood out was the figure in the corner of the frame, someone, or something, standing just out of view. A fleeting shadow, moving in and out of the camera's sight, as if it were deliberately avoiding being seen. What is that? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. His mind was racing. This was no coincidence. I don't know, detective. It wasn't there when we first checked the footage. We only found it now. The figure in the video moved with unnatural precision, always staying just out of sight, always lurking at the edges of the camera's reach. It seemed to be aware of the camera's presence, carefully maneuvering around it. That's it, Ethan muttered, his hands shaking. It's a person. No, it's not a person. It's something else. Someone who's been watching us. Who's been watching me? Marta looked at him, her face pale. Ethan, this is bigger than we thought. Whatever this is, it's not just a murder. It's a game. And we're the ones being played. Ethan's mind reeled. The shadows in the video weren't just an anomaly, they were a sign. Something was moving in the dark, something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And it was just getting started. He looked at Marta, his eyes filled with determination. We need to follow this. We need to find out who this is, what this is. The victim's thoughts, they're not just clues anymore. They're a warning. And so, the chase began again, deeper, darker, and more dangerous than ever before. Ethan knew one thing for certain now, the case wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about surviving whatever was lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to make his next move. The tension had now escalated, as Ethan and Marta were no longer just solving murders, they were entangled in something far more sinister. The whispers, the shadows, and the cryptic messages all pointed to an unknown force that had been manipulating them from the very beginning. As they delved deeper, they would discover that the line between hunter and hunted was blurrier than they could ever have imagined. And Ethan, for the first time in his career, had no idea where the next step would lead. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every step he took toward uncovering the truth only seemed to drag him deeper into a maze of shadows and lies. The video footage of the figure, now haunting his mind, was just the beginning. As the hours stretched into days, he felt as though he were being toyed with, his every move anticipated. He couldn't explain how, but somehow, someone, or something, was always a step ahead. Do you think it's connected to the murders? Marta asked, watching him closely. She had been by his side for years, but even she couldn't deny the transformation in him. He was no longer just solving crimes, he was chasing something intangible, something that threatened to unravel his very sense of reality. I don't know, Ethan replied, his voice low, as he paced back and forth in his apartment. But it's not just the murders. Something bigger is happening here. I can feel it. And it's not going to stop until it's finished with me. Marta looked at him, her brow furrowed with concern. Ethan, you've been running on fumes for days. Maybe it's time you take a step back. Rest. Let someone else. No. Ethan snapped, cutting her off. He turned to face her, his eyes wild with intensity. I can't stop now. Whoever is behind this, whatever is behind this, they want me to quit. They want me to walk away, and I won't give them the satisfaction. Marta remained silent for a long moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. She knew Ethan well enough to know that once his mind was made up, there was no changing it. But she also knew that this obsession could break him. Just then, the door to his apartment slammed open, and another officer, Detective Ryan, rushed in, his face flushed with panic. Detective Blackwell. You need to see this, Ryan said, his voice strained. Without waiting for a response, he thrust a folder into Ethan's hands. Ethan tore it open. Inside were new photographs, taken from a surveillance camera positioned near the last murder site. In the images, a shadowy figure was unmistakably present, this time, much closer. The figure's face was barely visible, but the unmistakable feeling of malice radiated from it. It was as though the figure were looking directly at the camera, aware of the eyes on it. It's him, Ethan muttered under his breath. I knew it. He's here. And he's watching me. We need to act fast, Ryan said urgently. We don't know who this person is, but if he's been this close to the crime scenes, we're running out of time. Ethan clenched his fists, his mind already whirling with possibilities. This wasn't just a killer hiding in the shadows anymore. This was someone who knew exactly how to manipulate the system. Someone who understood Ethan's every move. Get Marta, Ethan ordered, his voice sharp. We need to set up a perimeter around the city. If this guy wants a confrontation, I'll give it to him. He won't get the upper hand again. The next few days were a blur of preparation and strategy. Ethan and Marta, along with a team of officers, scoured every corner of the city for any sign of the shadowy figure. They searched abandoned buildings, dark alleyways, and even the city's underground tunnels. But despite their efforts, the figure remained elusive. Late one night, Ethan received a call from Marta. Her voice was trembling with urgency. Ethan, you need to come to the station. Now. He didn't wait for any more explanation. His heart pounded in his chest as he made his way to the station, dread gnawing at him. When he arrived, Marta was waiting for him, pale and visibly shaken. It's worse than we thought, Marta said, her eyes wide with fear. What's going on? Ethan asked, trying to steady his breath. Marta handed him a file, her hands shaking as she spoke. It's a message, from him. A letter. Ethan took the letter, his hands trembling. He unfolded it carefully, reading the words written in dark ink. You're getting closer, detective. But what you think you know is nothing more than a game. Every clue you follow, every victim's thought you hear, it's all part of the puzzle. But remember this, there's no way out once you start. You'll be lost in this labyrinth forever, just like the others. The blood drained from Ethan's face as he read the letter. The voice, he had been hearing it all along. It was him. The killer was taunting him, playing with him like a puppet on a string. Ethan's heart raced. This was it. The moment he had been dreading. There was no turning back now. Who is he, Marta? Tell me we have a lead. Ethan's voice cracked with frustration. But Marta shook her head. We don't know. He's always one step ahead. The only thing we know for sure is that he's watching us. Watching you. As if on cue, a loud bang echoed from the hallway, followed by shouting and hurried footsteps. The officers at the station scrambled to respond. Ethan's instincts kicked in. What is it? He demanded, rushing toward the door. It's a break-in. Ryan shouted. He's here, Ethan. He's in the building. A surge of adrenaline flooded Ethan's veins. His heart pounded louder than ever as he grabbed his gun and ran toward the source of the commotion. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This was the confrontation he had been waiting for, but it came with an overwhelming sense of dread. Who was this person? What were they capable of? The building was eerily quiet when they reached the control room. Ethan motioned for the officers to fan out, each one taking their position. His hands were clammy as he adjusted the grip on his weapon. This was it. The moment he'd been waiting for. He could feel the air thick with tension, every breath a struggle against the fear that clawed at him. Suddenly, a loud crash rang out, followed by a piercing scream. Ethan's heart stopped. "It's her!" Marta yelled, running toward the hallway. Ethan sprinted after her, but before he could reach her, the door to the stairwell slammed open, and a figure stepped into the hallway. The same figure from the video, the same shadow from the crime scenes. This time, his face was unmistakable, twisted in a grin that sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine. "You really think you're in control?" the man sneered. "You're just another pawn in this game, Blackwell." Ethan aimed his gun, his voice a low growl. "End it. Now." But the man only laughed. "You can't end it, detective. You're already too deep. You're in my world now." The man lunged, and the battle for control of the situation began, pushing Ethan further into the labyrinth of shadows he had been trying to escape. As the danger escalated, Ethan realized he wasn't just fighting a murderer. He was fighting his own unraveling sanity. The dim hallway buzzed with the stench of fear, an atmosphere thick enough to suffocate anyone who dared enter. Ethan's pulse raced as the figure in front of him, the shadowy murderer, grinned wider. His eyes, sharp, calculating, met Ethan's, sending a chill down his spine. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was the final act of a twisted game that Ethan hadn't even fully understood until now. And it was about to reach its peak. "Do you really think you can stop me?" the man sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. His grin widened further, revealing teeth that looked too sharp, too predatory. "You're too far gone, Blackwell. This is your fate. You're already in my world. And now, it's time for you to play by my rules." Ethan's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun, the cold metal biting into his palm. His entire body was trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what was happening. Every inch of his being screamed at him to act, to end this madness once and for all. But his mind was a battlefield, waging an internal war between the instinct to shoot and the knowledge that this man held the key to understanding everything. "You think I don't know that?" Ethan's voice was hoarse, edged with frustration and disbelief. "I've been in your game from the start. But I'm not just going to roll over. I'm going to finish this, no matter what it takes." The man chuckled darkly, his voice echoing down the hallway. "Finish it? There is no finishing, Blackwell. There's only a beginning, and you've already begun. You think you're the one hunting me? You're wrong. I'm hunting you." Before Ethan could react, the man lunged at him, a blur of movement. Ethan's instincts kicked in. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the man's outstretched arm, his feet skidding on the cold floor. His gunfire echoed through the building as he fired 2 shots, both missing their target. The figure was too fast. Too unpredictable. "Why are you doing this?" Ethan shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His mind was racing. "What do you want from me?" The man stopped, just out of reach. His head tilted slightly, as though considering Ethan's question. "I want you to see it, detective. I want you to understand. The voices, the clues, the game, it's all leading you here. To this moment." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The voices. He had been hearing them for weeks now, the whispered thoughts of the victims, guiding him, leading him through the dark. But each time, those whispers twisted, turned into riddles, and then, disappeared. "That's why you're doing this." Ethan asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. You think I need to hear the voices to solve your puzzle? That's it? That's the whole plan? The man smiled, slow and cold. It's not about the voices, Blackwell. It's about you. You were never meant to be the detective in this story. You were meant to be the pawn. And now you're finally seeing it. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What was he saying? All this time, had he really been nothing more than a player in someone else's game? He had been so obsessed with solving the murders, with finding the truth, that he hadn't stopped to consider the possibility that he was being manipulated. That he was never meant to uncover the real mystery, that his mind was just a playground for someone else's twisted amusement. No, Ethan breathed, more to himself than anyone else. This can't be it. I'm not just some toy to be controlled. I can still. Before he could finish, the man closed the distance between them in a heartbeat, slamming Ethan against the wall. The breath was knocked out of him, and for a moment, everything blurred. But then, the words, those voices, came crashing back into his mind. Don't give up. You're almost there. Fight! Fight back! The voices, no, their voices, flooded his thoughts, the victims who had died, the ones who had been calling out to him. It was them. They needed him to fight. To end this. To stop the game. Ethan's eyes snapped open, his hands going to the gun at his side. But in that moment, everything changed. His thoughts cleared, the fog of confusion lifting. The voices weren't just whispers anymore. They were his guide, his weapon, his shield. And they were telling him one thing, finish it. With a growl, Ethan thrust the gun forward, pressing it to the man's chest. The figure's eyes widened in surprise, just for a second, but that was all Ethan needed. With a quick, decisive movement, Ethan pulled the trigger. The shot rang out, echoing through the narrow hallways. The man staggered back, his chest smoking, his mouth open in shock. Ethan's breath was ragged, but his eyes never left the figure before him. You thought you could control me? Ethan whispered, his voice low, full of dark satisfaction. You were wrong. The man's hands trembled as he reached for his chest, where blood was seeping through his clothes. His grin never fully disappeared, but the madness in his eyes began to fade. You can't stop this, the man rasped, struggling to stay upright. You'll never be free. You'll hear their voices, forever. Ethan's heart clenched at the words, but his resolve remained steady. He didn't need to understand the full scope of the madness. He didn't need to know everything. He just needed to know that it ended here. That this twisted game was over. He couldn't allow himself to be haunted by these thoughts anymore. The man fell to his knees, gasping for breath, the grin now replaced by a grimace of pain. Ethan stood over him, the weight of the situation pressing down on his chest. The game, the chase, it was all over. The pieces had finally fallen into place. But as the figure's life slowly slipped away, a strange sense of relief washed over Ethan. The voices, the victims, had stopped. No more whispers. No more taunting. The mystery was over, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt something like peace. As the man's body slumped to the floor, Ethan exhaled a shaky breath. The adrenaline began to fade, and the realization of what he had done hit him like a wave. He had won. The game was over. But there would be no more victory laps, no celebration. There was only the quiet, the aftermath, and the price he had paid to escape. His eyes shifted to the exit. He didn't know where he was going next, but for the first time, he didn't care. The shadows were gone. The whispers were silent. And Ethan Blackwell, for all his flaws, could finally walk away. The building was silent now, the echoes of gunfire long faded into the shadows. Ethan stood motionless, his body still vibrating with the remnants of adrenaline, his breath coming in shallow bursts. The man, the figure who had stalked him for so long, who had twisted his life into a dangerous, almost surreal game, was gone. The threat had been neutralized, but something deep within Ethan had changed. The relief of survival was there, but it was tempered by the weight of everything that had happened. He took a tentative step forward, his gaze fixed on the body of the man on the ground. There was no triumph in the moment, just the cold realization that, despite everything, he was still alive. A voice broke through his thoughts, soft and uncertain. "Ethan." He turned to see Marta standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale. She had been close behind, though he hadn't heard her footsteps. His mind still raced, processing everything, his victory, the sacrifices, the cost. "Is it over?" Marta asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile calm that had settled in. Ethan nodded slowly, his hand still clutching his gun, though it felt heavier now. He didn't know how to answer. What could he say? "Yes, it's over" felt too simple, too final. "I think so," he replied, his voice strained, unsure if the words were meant for Marta or himself. He looked at the man on the ground again, now lifeless, a symbol of the chaos that had consumed him for weeks. Ethan had finally ended it, but the relief he expected never came. Instead, a quiet emptiness settled inside him. The game was over. But what did that really mean? Marta approached cautiously, her eyes flickering to the body before meeting Ethan's gaze. "You did what you had to do," she said softly, her voice full of empathy. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch warm, grounding him. "But you don't have to carry all of this alone." Ethan gave a tight smile, though it felt foreign. He had been so wrapped up in his pursuit of the truth, so consumed by his need to solve the puzzle, that he had forgotten what mattered outside of the case. Now, standing in the aftermath of it all, he realized how much of himself he had lost in the process. "I know," he murmured, his voice hoarse. I didn't think it would feel like this." Marta squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. "You're not alone, Ethan. You've never been alone in this." Ethan felt a flicker of something, gratefulness, perhaps. But it was quickly overshadowed by the weight of what he had done. He had taken a life, even if it was the life of someone who had reveled in destruction. And now, as he stood here, surrounded by the aftermath of his actions, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. He had won, but had he truly won? Or had he simply become another part of the game he had so desperately tried to control? The next few days were a blur of paperwork, investigations, and interviews. The world outside the building seemed almost distant, like a place he could never fully return to. Ethan and Marta worked tirelessly to piece together the full extent of the man's plan. The investigation revealed that the figure had been manipulating not just Ethan, but others as well, an entire network of criminals, orchestrating everything from the shadows. It was a labyrinth of lies and deceit, and now, with the mastermind gone, it was up to Ethan to help unravel it all. But as the days stretched on, Ethan found that the more he uncovered, the more questions he had. There were pieces of the puzzle that didn't fit, things that didn't make sense. The idea that everything had been a game, it gnawed at him. The killer had wanted him to see the truth, but what if the truth wasn't as simple as he thought? What if the real game was just beginning? "Are you all right?" Marta's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She had noticed the shift in him. The exhaustion in his eyes. The way his once steady hands now trembled as he sifted through evidence. "I'm fine," Ethan replied, though the words were hollow. He wasn't fine. He wasn't even close. Just thinking. She didn't press him, but he could tell she was concerned. "You've done everything you can, Ethan. More than anyone else could have done. It's over. You've stopped him. And now, you can start to heal. You don't have to keep chasing shadows." Ethan looked at her, a wry smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Shadows. That's all I've been chasing, isn't it?" Marta said nothing, but her gaze softened. She knew the burden of the job, the way it clung to you long after the case was closed. It was always there, lurking in the back of your mind, like an itch you could never quite scratch. You're right, he finally said, his voice quieter now. It's over. For now. But I don't think I can walk away from this. Not just yet. Marta sighed, but there was understanding in her expression. You can't save everyone, Ethan. You can't fix everything. I know, he said, looking down at the stack of papers in front of him. But I have to try. Days passed, and the city began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The streets were bustling with life again, the hum of traffic and distant conversations slowly filling the air once more. The mystery had been solved. The killer was dead. But for Ethan, things would never be the same. The truth was, he had changed. The investigation, the chase, the culmination of everything that had happened, it had forced him to confront parts of himself he hadn't known existed. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was someone who had been pushed to his limits, someone who had seen the darkness in others, and in himself. But despite the turmoil, there was a flicker of hope in his chest. The voices, the ones that had haunted him for so long, were finally silent. The game was over. And in its place, a new kind of peace was beginning to grow within him. The kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from learning how to live with what you've lost, and what you've gained. Marta was right. He didn't have to carry the weight of it all alone. There was a way forward, no matter how uncertain it seemed. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would face whatever came next. For now, though, Ethan allowed himself to pause. To breathe. To let the silence fill the spaces left by the chaos. Because, in the end, the most important thing was that he had survived. And that, for the first time in a long while, felt like enough. As the days slowly blended into one another on the island, Ethan's world became quieter. The hum of the city, the relentless noise of his old life, seemed like a distant memory. The chaotic pursuit of the killer had long since ended, but the battle to find peace inside himself, inside his fractured soul, had only just begun. The beach now felt less like a prison and more like a refuge, though that word still tasted foreign on his tongue. His feet dug into the cool sand as he sat, his back resting against a large, weathered rock. The waves lapped gently at the shore, a soft rhythm that spoke of time's slow passing. There was something about the stillness now, a tranquility that felt earned, like a reward after a battle well fought. Ethan had come to realize that, in a way, he was just as lost as the island itself. But here, in this strange new world, he was learning to rebuild. Marta had left the island, returning to the city to report on the aftermath. She had insisted on going, wanting to bring closure to the investigation and share the story of what had happened. Ethan had wanted to go with her, to leave this place behind. But deep down, he knew he needed more time. He needed to find the next step, not just in the case, but in his life. The island had shown him that the answers he was searching for couldn't be found in the past. They had to come from within. He had spent the past few days alone, combing through the wreckage of the shipwreck that had stranded him here, taking inventory of everything that had been left behind. There were scraps of wood, pieces of metal, and the remnants of old supplies. It wasn't much. But it was enough to survive. He had taken his time, working carefully to build a raft, a fragile thing, pieced together with whatever materials he could find. At first, it had seemed impossible. The waves had looked too wild, the task too daunting. But with each passing day, something had shifted inside him. The island, with all its secrets and dangers, had forced him to grow. To be resourceful. To trust in himself again. The raft, crude as it was ready. The small craft bobbed gently in the water, tied to a post he had fashioned out of driftwood. Ethan stood on the shore, staring at it. His hand rested on his hip, his eyes narrowed against the sunlight. The raft wasn't much. But it was his way out. For a moment, doubt crept in, an old, familiar companion. What if the ocean was too vast? What if the raft fell apart in the middle of the sea? What if he failed? But these thoughts no longer held the same power they once had. He had come this far, and no matter the uncertainty that lay ahead, he would continue. Not because he had no fear, but because he had learned to face it. Ethan took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment. The world around him felt alive, vibrant in its stillness. He heard the birds calling from the trees, the rustling of the wind through the leaves. He hadn't noticed the small wonders of life until now, too busy chasing after the danger that had consumed him. But today, as the sun dipped lower in the sky, he felt grateful for the silence. From behind, he heard footsteps in the sand, and he turned to see Marta walking toward him, her expression unreadable. "I thought I might find you here," she said softly, her voice carrying an unexpected weight. Her eyes rested on the raft, and then slowly met his gaze. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Ethan nodded, his throat tight. There was so much he wanted to say, but the words didn't come. They had shared a journey, one that had tested both of them in ways they hadn't anticipated. In some ways, they had both been broken, by the man who had manipulated them, by the island, by the grief they carried. But now, they stood at the edge of something new. A new beginning, though neither of them knew where it would lead. "I think it's time," he said finally, his voice slow but steady. "It's time to move on." Marta didn't speak right away. Instead, she walked toward him, standing beside him on the sand, gazing out at the raft and then at the horizon. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink, the last vestiges of daylight slipping away. The vastness of the ocean stretched out before them, uncertain, uncharted, just like the future. But it was a future Ethan was now ready to face. "You've come a long way," Marta said softly, almost to herself. "I know you didn't think you could, but you did. You've learned how to survive, Ethan. And not just on this island. But in your life." Ethan glanced at her, his heart tightening in his chest. He had never thought of it that way. All along, he had been running from the ghosts of his past, trying to find some sense of closure, of victory. But it wasn't until this moment, standing here with Marta, on the edge of something new, that he realized he had already found it. The victory wasn't in the case, or the killer. It wasn't in the chase, or the fight. It was in learning to live again, in learning to be present, to accept the uncertainty and move forward. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't realize how much I needed someone, until you were here." Marta smiled, though it was bittersweet. "You're stronger than you think. And you're not alone anymore. Not in the ways that matter." The silence between them stretched for a moment, but it was a comfortable silence, one filled with understanding. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Ethan turned toward the raft and untied it, the wooden planks creaking as he pushed it gently into the water. The journey ahead was unknown, but that no longer scared him. The journey was his to make, and for the first time in a long while, he felt ready. Marta watched him as he stepped onto the raft, steadying himself with practiced ease. She didn't need to say anything more. She knew he was ready, just as he knew he could face whatever came next. "Goodbye, Marta," Ethan said softly. "Goodbye, Ethan," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. With one final glance back at the island, Ethan pushed off from the shore, the raft gliding gently across the water. The island faded into the distance, a part of his past, a chapter he had closed. And as the stars began to emerge in the sky above, he realized the journey had only just begun. This time, however, he would walk forward with a quiet strength, unburdened by the shadows of the past, ready to find his place in a new world. The future was uncertain. But for the first time, Ethan felt ready to meet it, one step at a time.